Sometimes the most extraordinary discoveries lie hidden beneath the most ordinary moments. David Mitchell thought he had found his sanctuary in the rolling hills of Pennsylvania, a place where the ghosts of war could finally rest. But when a summer thunderstorm tore through his backyard, it would unearth secrets that had been buried for 8 decades, secrets that would challenge everything he thought he knew about honor, sacrifice, and the true cost of freedom. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through the dense canopy of oak and maple trees that surrounded the small farmhouse David Mitchell now called home. It was a modest 2-story structure built sometime in the 1920s, its white clapboard siding weathered to a soft gray that seemed to blend naturally with the Pennsylvania countryside. The wraparound porch creaked pleasantly under his weight as he stepped outside, carrying his first cup of coffee of the day. David was 47 years old, though the lines around his green eyes and the silver threading through his auburn hair made him appear older. 25 years in the army had carved deep grooves into his weathered face, and his broad shoulders carried themselves with the permanent posture of a man who had spent decades standing at attention. He was of medium height but built like a fortress, with the kind of solid, compact strength that came from a lifetime of physical discipline. He wore his usual morning uniform, a faded grey Henley shirt, well-worn denim jeans and steel-toed work boots that had seen more construction sites than battlefields. A simple silver chain around his neck disappeared beneath his shirt, and his left hand bore a simple gold wedding band that he had never been able to bring himself to remove, even 3 years after Sarah's passing. The property he had purchased with his retirement savings was 37 acres of mixed woodland and meadow, far enough from the nearest town of Millfield to ensure the kind of solitude he craved. The realtor had mentioned that the land had once been part of a larger farm that had been subdivided over the decades, but David hadn't paid much attention to the history. He was more interested in the present, in the silence, in the space, in the opportunity to finally breathe without the weight of command pressing down on his chest. His companion emerged from the house behind him, nails clicking softly on the wooden porch. Bruno was a 7-year-old Belgian Malinois, a magnificent animal with a golden fawn coat marked by a distinctive black mask around his intelligent dark eyes. Unlike many military working dogs, Bruno had never served in combat, but he possessed the same unwavering loyalty and keen intelligence that made his breed legendary among soldiers. David had found Bruno at a veterans rehabilitation center 2 years earlier. The dog had been donated by a family who could no longer care for him, and something in the animal's patient, watchful demeanor had immediately resonated with David's own sense of displacement. They were both veterans of different kinds, both learning to navigate a world that no longer required their particular skills. Bruno stretched and yawned, then padded over to sit beside David on the porch steps. The dog's presence had become an essential part of David's daily routine, a living reminder that loyalty and trust could still exist in a world that often felt chaotic and unpredictable. Bruno had an uncanny ability to sense David's moods, appearing at his side during the dark moments when memories of Afghanistan would creep in uninvited. The morning ritual was simple but sacred. David would sit on the porch steps with his coffee while Bruno explored the immediate area around the house, investigating the scents left by nocturnal visitors, deer, raccoons, the occasional fox. The dog would return periodically to check on his master, a living security system that never clocked out or took a day off. On this particular morning in late July, the air was thick with humidity, and the sky held the peculiar yellow-green tint that often preceded severe weather in this part of Pennsylvania. David had learned to read these signs during his childhood in rural Ohio, where summer storms could appear with little warning and unleash devastating fury. The forecast had called for thunderstorms, but David had weathered plenty of storms in this old house. The structure was solid, built by craftsmen who understood that Pennsylvania weather demanded respect. The foundation was fieldstone, the framing was solid oak, and the roof had been recently updated with modern shingles that could withstand hurricane-force winds. Bruno returned from his morning patrol and settled at David's feet, his ears rotating like radar dishes as he monitored the sounds of the awakening countryside. Birds called from the tree line, a distant tractor rumbled across a neighboring field, and somewhere a church bell marked the passage of another hour in a place where time seemed to move at a more reasonable pace. David had chosen this location specifically for its isolation. The nearest neighbor was Mrs. Eleanor Kowalski, a widow in her 80s who lived in a small cottage nearly a mile down the gravel road that served as their shared driveway. She kept to herself, as did David, and their relationship consisted mainly of friendly waves when they encountered each other checking their mailboxes. The farmhouse sat at the end of a long, winding lane that branched off from County Road 47, a narrow blacktop that connected Millfield to the state highway. The lane was rutted gravel that required careful navigation in wet weather, but it served as an effective deterrent to casual visitors. David preferred it that way. He had spent too many years surrounded by people, responsible for their safety, their morale, their very lives. The solitude was not loneliness, it was medicine. His retirement from the army had not been entirely voluntary. A roadside bomb outside Kandahar had ended his career along with the careers of 3 other soldiers in his convoy. David had been the lucky one. He had walked away with nothing more than a concussion and some shrapnel scars along his left arm. The other 3 had not been so fortunate. The transition to civilian life had been more difficult than any mission he had ever undertaken. The army had been his identity for more than half his life, and suddenly he was just another middle-aged man with a military pension and a collection of skills that had little application in peaceful society. The grief counseling had helped with Sarah's death from cancer, but it had done little to address the more complex challenge of simply learning how to exist without purpose. The farm had given him that purpose, in small, manageable increments. There was always something that needed repair, something that required his attention and his hands. He had spent the past year methodically working through a list of projects, replacing rotted porch boards, updating the electrical system, reinforcing the barn that stood behind the house. The barn was a particular point of pride. Built in the 1940s, it was a classic Pennsylvania bank barn with a stone foundation and massive hand-hewn timber framing. David had spent months learning traditional joinery techniques to properly restore the structure, finding a kind of meditation in the precise, careful work of fitting mortise and tenon joints. Behind the barn, a large vegetable garden provided fresh produce and another form of therapeutic labor. David had never considered himself particularly domestic, but there was something deeply satisfying about coaxing life from soil, about nurturing plants from seed to harvest. The garden was Bruno's favorite place to patrol, and the dog had appointed himself guardian against the rabbits and groundhogs that viewed David's tomatoes and corn as a personal buffer. The property also included a small pond that had been created by damming a seasonal creek. It was stocked with bass and bluegill, providing both recreation and an emergency food source, though David had found that he preferred the peaceful act of fishing to the actual consumption of his catch. Most of his fish were photographed and released, though Bruno had developed a taste for the occasional perch. As the morning progressed, the atmospheric pressure began to drop noticeably. Bruno became increasingly restless, pacing the porch and whining softly at sounds only he could hear. Dogs were natural barometers, and Bruno's sensitivity to weather changes had proven remarkably accurate over the past 2 years. David finished his coffee and stood, stretching muscles that had grown stiff during his contemplative hour on the porch. At 47, his body was beginning to remind him of decades of hard use, but he maintained the fitness regimen that had been drilled into him during his military service. Push-ups, sit-ups and long runs with Bruno kept him in better shape than most men half his age. The first task of the day was checking the storm preparations he had completed the previous evening. The porch furniture had been secured, the barn doors had been latched, and the generator in the basement had been tested and fueled. Power outages were common during severe weather, and David had learned to be self-sufficient in all things. Bruno accompanied him on his inspection tour, the dog's nose working constantly as he investigated the changes in scent that preceded major weather events. Animals possessed an awareness of natural phenomena that humans had largely lost, and David had learned to trust Bruno's instincts as much as his own military-trained intuition. The wind began to pick up around noon, bending the tall grass in the meadow and causing the leaves on the oak trees to show their silver undersides. The air pressure continued to drop, creating the distinctive feeling of heaviness that preceded severe storms. David had experienced this phenomenon in various parts of the world, from the monsoons of Southeast Asia to the thunderstorms of the American Midwest, and the signs were always the same. He brought Bruno inside as the first drops of rain began to spatter against the windows. The house was comfortable and well appointed, with modern appliances and updated plumbing, but it retained the character of its original construction. Wide plank floors creaked pleasantly underfoot, and the windows were the original wavy glass that cast interesting patterns of light across the rooms. David had furnished the space simply but comfortably, with sturdy furniture that reflected his practical nature. A leather sofa faced a stone fireplace in the living room, flanked by built-in bookcases that held his collection of military histories and technical manuals. The kitchen was modern but small, adequate for a man who had spent decades eating military rations and had never developed sophisticated culinary tastes. The rain began in earnest around 2 in the afternoon, starting as a gentle patter and quickly building to a steady drumming on the metal roof. David settled in his favorite chair with a book, while Bruno took up his usual position by the front window, where he could monitor the approach to the house while keeping one ear tuned to his master's movements. By 3 o'clock the storm had intensified dramatically. Lightning illuminated the darkened afternoon sky in brilliant stroboscopic flashes, followed by tremendous crashes of thunder that rattled the windows and caused Bruno to pace nervously between the living room and the kitchen. The rain had become a torrent, driven nearly horizontal by winds that David estimated were approaching 60 miles per hour. This was clearly more than the typical summer thunderstorm the weather service had predicted. The wind was consistent and powerful, suggesting the presence of a derecho, a land-based hurricane that could produce sustained winds comparable to a Category 1 hurricane. David had experienced similar weather events during his time stationed in Kansas, and he knew they could cause extensive damage. The power went out at 3:30, plunging the house into premature twilight. David lit several hurricane lamps that he kept strategically placed throughout the house, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Bruno immediately moved to his side, the dog's instincts telling him that his master might need protection during this period of vulnerability. The storm reached its peak intensity around 4 o'clock. The wind howled like a living thing, and David could hear debris striking the house, branches, shingles from neighboring buildings, possibly pieces of roof torn from less substantial structures. The sound was reminiscent of artillery fire, a constant barrage that triggered memories he preferred to keep buried. Bruno sensed his master's tension and pressed against David's leg, providing physical comfort and emotional support. The dog's warm weight was an anchor, pulling David back from the edge of memories that could quickly spiral into darkness. This was why he had Bruno, why he needed Bruno. The dog was not just a companion, he was a lifeline. Through the window, when lightning illuminated the landscape, David could see the trees bending at impossible angles. Several had already fallen, their massive trunks blocking the lane and creating temporary dams in the swollen creek. The pond had overflowed its banks, turning the low-lying areas of his property into temporary lakes. The worst of the storm passed after an hour of sustained fury, leaving behind a steady rain and occasional gusts of wind that seemed gentle by comparison. David ventured onto the covered porch to assess the immediate damage, with Bruno close behind him. The air was clean and cool, washed free of dust and pollen, carrying the fresh scent of rain-soaked earth and broken vegetation. The destruction was extensive but not catastrophic. Several large branches had fallen across the driveway, and one of the barn's doors had been torn from its hinges despite David's efforts to secure it.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The vegetable garden was flattened, a summer's worth of careful cultivation, destroyed in less than 2 hours. But it was the view toward the back of the property that took David's breath away. A massive oak tree that had stood near the rear fence line for what must have been more than a century had been completely uprooted. The giant had fallen toward the house, but mercifully had been deflected by several smaller trees, causing it to crash into the open meadow instead. The root system that had been torn from the earth was enormous, creating a crater nearly 20 feet across and 8 feet deep. Dirt and rocks had been flung in all directions, and the exposed roots reached toward the grey sky like the fingers of some buried giant. It was a scene of natural violence, the kind of destruction that reminded humans of their essential powerlessness in the face of natural forces. David and Bruno made their way carefully across the debris-strewn yard to examine the fallen giant. The tree had been healthy and strong, its trunk nearly 4 feet in diameter, but the storm had generated winds powerful enough to overcome even its deep roots. The root ball was a complex mass of wood and earth, creating an abstract sculpture of natural destruction. Bruno immediately began investigating the crater, his nose working intently as he explored the newly exposed earth. Dogs were naturally curious about changes in their environment, and the upheaval had created an entirely new landscape of scents and textures for him to catalogue. He moved methodically around the perimeter of the hole, occasionally pausing to dig at particularly interesting spots. David was about to call the dog away when Bruno's behavior changed dramatically. The animal had been exploring with the casual interest of a tourist, but suddenly his posture shifted to one of intense focus. He had discovered something near the deepest part of the crater, something that had captured his complete attention. Bruno began to whine and pace, alternating between staring at David and returning to the same spot in the crater. This was not casual curiosity. This was the alert behavior that David had seen in military working dogs when they detected something significant. The dog was trying to communicate, using every tool in his behavioral arsenal to convey urgency. David slid carefully down into the muddy crater, following Bruno's lead. The exposed earth was a mixture of clay and loam, studded with rocks and root fragments. The sides of the hole were unstable, and David had to move carefully to avoid causing a collapse. Bruno led him to the eastern edge of the crater, where the root system had torn away a significant section of subsoil. There, partially exposed in the muddy wall, David could see something that definitely did not belong in nature. It was a straight edge, too precise to be natural stone, too regular to be root or fallen timber. He brushed away mud and loose dirt with his hands, gradually exposing more of the object. It was concrete, a flat, smooth surface that extended both horizontally and vertically, clearly part of some kind of constructed wall or foundation. The concrete was old, weathered to a gray-green color, but it was obviously man-made. David's engineering training kicked in as he examined the structure, noting the quality of the concrete and the precision of the construction. Bruno continued to pace and whine, his excitement building as David uncovered more of the mysterious structure. The dog's behavior suggested that there was more to discover, that the visible concrete was just the beginning of something larger. David trusted Bruno's instincts completely. The animal had never led him astray. Working with his hands and a fallen branch that served as an improvised tool, David began to clear more dirt from around the concrete structure. What he gradually revealed was the corner of what appeared to be a buried room or chamber. The walls were thick, designed for permanence and strength, and they extended deeper into the earth than the storm had exposed.
The construction technique and materials suggested that the structure dated from the World War II era, when concrete construction had become standardized and widely used for military installations. David had seen similar construction in Europe, where bunkers and defensive positions from the war years were still occasionally discovered. As he worked, David began to notice other details that supported his growing suspicion about the age and purpose of the buried structure. The concrete had been poured with careful attention to drainage, and he could see the remains of what appeared to be waterproofing materials around the joints. This was not a casual construction project. It had been built by people who understood the challenges of underground construction. Bruno's excitement reached a fever pitch when David uncovered what appeared to be the outline of a door or entrance. The opening had been sealed with additional concrete, but the rectangular shape was clearly visible, and there were metal fixtures embedded in the concrete that might once have supported hinges or a locking mechanism. The discovery transformed David's understanding of his property. What he had thought was simply rural farmland with a long agricultural history was clearly something more complex. Someone at some point in the past had gone to considerable effort and expense to construct a substantial underground facility and then conceal it so completely that it had remained hidden for decades. The implications were both exciting and unsettling. David's military experience had taught him that hidden installations were often hidden for good reasons. During World War II, the federal government had constructed numerous classified facilities throughout the United States, many of which had been abandoned and forgotten after the war ended. The location made sense for such a facility. Rural Pennsylvania had been far from the coastal areas that were vulnerable to enemy attack, but close enough to major industrial centers to serve logistical and administrative functions. The federal government had requisitioned private land throughout the region for various war-related purposes, often with agreements that required the restoration of the land to its original condition after the war. David stood in the crater, looking at the concrete structure that Bruno had helped him discover, and felt the first stirrings of genuine curiosity he had experienced in months. This was a mystery with historical significance, a puzzle that connected his peaceful rural retreat to the great conflict that had shaped the modern world. Bruno continued to pace around the exposed concrete, occasionally pawing at the sealed entrance as if trying to open it through sheer determination. The dog's persistence suggested that there was something inside the buried structure that continued to capture his attention, perhaps trapped air carrying scents from the interior, or structural vibrations that his sensitive hearing could detect. The storm had ended, leaving behind a landscape transformed by wind and water, but for David Mitchell and his faithful companion Bruno, it had also revealed the beginning of a mystery that would challenge everything they thought they knew about their quiet corner of Pennsylvania. The buried secrets of the past were about to collide with the present in ways that neither man nor dog could possibly anticipate. The evening settled over the property with the peculiar clarity that often follows severe weather. The air was cool and clean, washed free of the humidity that had oppressed the region for weeks. Stars were beginning to appear in the clearing sky, and the normal sounds of the countryside were gradually returning: crickets, tree frogs, the distant hoot of an owl claiming territory in the darkness. David sat on his porch, a cup of hot coffee warming his hands while Bruno lay at his feet with the satisfied exhaustion of a dog who had accomplished something important. The generator hummed quietly in the basement, providing power for the essential systems while the local utility crews worked to restore service to the rural areas. The discovery in the crater had left David with more questions than answers. His practical military mind was already working through the logistics of further investigation. He would need proper tools, shovels, buckets, perhaps a small sledgehammer to break through the sealed entrance. He would need to be careful about structural integrity, ensuring that any excavation didn't compromise the stability of the underground chamber. But beyond the practical considerations, David found himself genuinely intrigued by the historical puzzle that had literally been unearthed in his backyard. His reading had included extensive study of the American home front during World War II, and he knew that the federal government had constructed thousands of facilities throughout the country to support the war effort. Many of these installations had been classified at the time and remained largely forgotten in the decades that followed. Some had been communication centers, others had served as storage facilities for strategic materials, and still others had housed research and development projects that pushed the boundaries of technology and science. The concrete structure buried beneath his property appeared to be substantial enough to have served any of these purposes. The quality of construction suggested significant federal investment, and the care taken to conceal the facility indicated that its original purpose had been sensitive or classified. David's curiosity was further piqued by Bruno's continued interest in the site. Even now, hours after the discovery, the dog would periodically raise his head and stare toward the back of the property, as if monitoring the buried structure for changes or developments. Bruno's senses were far more acute than David's, and his persistent attention suggested that there was more to discover. The practical challenges of investigation were significant but not insurmountable. David had the tools and skills necessary to safely excavate the entrance to the buried facility. His military engineering background included training in demolition and construction, and he understood the safety protocols necessary for underground work. More importantly, he had the time and privacy necessary for a thorough investigation. His property was isolated, his nearest neighbor was nearly a mile away, and he was accountable to no one but himself for how he spent his retirement. If the buried structure contained historically significant artifacts or documents, he would certainly notify the appropriate authorities, but there was no immediate urgency that would prevent him from satisfying his own curiosity first. The discovery had also awakened something in David that had been dormant since his retirement, a sense of mission, of purpose beyond simple daily survival. For the first time in months, he found himself planning beyond the immediate needs of property maintenance and personal care. He had a project that engaged both his practical skills and his intellectual curiosity. Bruno stirred at his feet, raising his head to stare into the darkness toward the crater. The dog's ears were pricked forward, and David could see the tension in his muscular frame that indicated heightened alertness. David followed the dog's gaze but could see nothing unusual in the dim starlight. After several minutes, Bruno relaxed and settled back into his resting position, but the brief alert had reminded David of the dog's extraordinary sensory capabilities. If there were sound sense or vibrations associated with the buried structure that escaped human detection, Bruno would be the first to notice them. The night passed peacefully, with only the normal sounds of a rural property recovering from severe weather. David slept better than he had in weeks, perhaps because the discovery had given him something positive to anticipate rather than simply another day of routine maintenance and solitary reflection. Morning brought bright sunshine and the first opportunity for David to properly assess the storm damage throughout his property. Bruno accompanied him on a systematic survey of the 37 acres, cataloging fallen trees, damaged fencing and debris that would need to be cleared. The vegetable garden was a total loss, but that was a minor concern compared to the potential significance of the buried structure. The crater remained exactly as they had left it, the exposed concrete wall waiting patiently for further investigation. David spent the morning gathering the tools he would need for a proper excavation. From his well-equipped workshop, he selected shovels of various sizes, buckets for moving dirt and debris, a small sledgehammer for breaking through concrete, and safety equipment including a hard hat, work gloves and a battery-powered headlamp. He also assembled a basic archaeological kit based on his reading about proper excavation techniques. This included small brushes for delicate work, plastic bags for storing artifacts, a camera for documenting discoveries, and a notebook for recording observations and measurements. Bruno supervised these preparations with the alert interest of a dog who understood that something significant was about to happen. The animal's excitement was palpable, and David found himself looking forward to the investigation with an enthusiasm he had not felt in months. The excavation began in earnest after lunch, when the afternoon sun provided optimal lighting for detailed work. David approached the project with the methodical precision that had served him well during his military career, working slowly and carefully to avoid damaging any potential artifacts or compromising the structural integrity of the buried facility. Bruno stationed himself at the edge of the crater, serving as both observer and early warning system for any approaching visitors. The dog's presence was reassuring, and his occasional whines of encouragement provided a soundtrack for the steady work of clearing dirt and debris from around the sealed entrance. As more of the concrete structure was exposed, David's initial assessment proved correct.
This was clearly a substantial underground facility, built during the World War II era with federal funding and constructed according to military specifications. The walls were reinforced concrete, nearly 2 feet thick, designed to withstand both natural disasters and potential enemy action. The sealed entrance was gradually revealed as a steel door set into a concrete frame, secured with what appeared to be military-grade locks and sealed with additional concrete poured around the edges. The level of security was impressive, suggesting that whatever had been stored inside the facility had been considered extremely valuable or sensitive. David paused in his work to photograph and document his discoveries, creating a visual record that would be invaluable regardless of what else he might find. The historical significance of the site was already clear, and proper documentation would ensure that future researchers would have access to complete information about the discovery process. Bruno's behavior throughout the afternoon confirmed David's growing conviction that there was something significant waiting inside the buried facility. The dog remained focused and alert, occasionally moving to different positions around the crater, as if trying to get a better angle on whatever was capturing his attention. As the sun began to set, David had succeeded in completely exposing the sealed entrance to the buried structure. The steel door was corroded but intact, and the concrete ceiling material appeared to be of more recent vintage than the original construction, possibly added during the post-war period when the facility was abandoned and sealed. Standing in the crater, looking at the entrance to a buried facility that had remained hidden for more than 70 years, David felt the same mixture of anticipation and apprehension that had preceded every significant mission during his military career. Tomorrow he would attempt to breach the entrance and discover what secrets had been waiting patiently in the Pennsylvania earth for more than 7 decades. Bruno seemed to sense the importance of the moment, positioning himself between David and the sealed door as if standing guard over the threshold between present and past. The dog's steady presence was a reminder that some discoveries were best made with trusted companions, and that the most valuable treasures were often found not in isolation, but in partnership with those who shared our journey through an uncertain world. The mystery buried beneath David Mitchell's peaceful Pennsylvania farm was about to reveal its secrets, and both man and dog stood ready to face whatever truths had been waiting so patiently for their moment of discovery. The morning air carried the crisp promise of autumn as David prepared for what he knew would be the most significant excavation of his civilian life. He had spent the dawn hours organizing his tools with military precision, laying out everything on a canvas tarp beside the crater. The sledgehammer gleamed in the early sunlight, its weight promising the power needed to breach whatever barriers time and bureaucracy had placed between him and the truth. Bruno had awakened before David, positioning himself at the bedroom window that faced toward the back of the property. The dog's silent vigil had continued through breakfast, his dark eyes fixed on the exposed concrete structure, as if monitoring it for changes that only his enhanced senses could detect. When David finally gathered his equipment and headed toward the crater, Bruno bounded ahead with the enthusiasm of a working animal returning to an important task. The first challenge was accessing the sealed door safely. David had constructed a makeshift ladder from 2x4s, allowing him to descend into the crater without risking injury from the unstable earthen walls. The root system of the fallen oak had created a natural framework that helped stabilize the excavation, but David knew that any significant vibration could cause additional collapse. Standing before the steel door, David could see that the original military hardware had been substantial. The hinges were massive, designed to support a door that must have weighed several hundred pounds.
The locking mechanism appeared to be a combination of mechanical locks and what looked like the remains of a chain and padlock system. All of it had been rendered moot by the concrete that had been poured around the edges of the door, creating an impermeable seal. David began with careful strikes along the concrete seal, using a cold chisel to score the material before applying the sledgehammer. The work was slow and methodical, requiring frequent breaks to clear debris and assess his progress. Bruno maintained his position at the edge of the crater, occasionally barking encouragement or alerting David to the approach of distant vehicles on County Road 47. After 2 hours of steady work, David had succeeded in breaking away most of the concrete seal. The original door was now visible in its entirety, and he could see that the steel, while heavily corroded, remained structurally sound. The locks, however, had been destroyed by decades of moisture and oxidation. They would need to be cut or broken to gain access to whatever lay beyond. David switched to a smaller sledgehammer and a heavy-duty pry bar, working to separate the corroded lock mechanisms from their mounting points. The metal protested with sharp cracks and groans, but gradually yielded to persistent pressure. Bruno's excitement increased with each sound, the dog pacing back and forth along the crater's edge, as if sensing that breakthrough was imminent. The final lock gave way with a sound like a gunshot, the metal fracturing along stress lines that had been weakened by decades of corrosion. David set down his tools and grasped the heavy steel handle, applying steady pressure to overcome the resistance of corroded hinges and twisted metal. The door moved perhaps an inch, then stuck fast. More work with the pry bar eventually freed the hinges sufficiently to allow the door to swing open, revealing a rectangle of absolute darkness that seemed to absorb the morning sunlight. A wave of stale air flowed from the opening, carrying scents that spoke of decades of undisturbed isolation, dust, metal, the peculiar smell of spaces that had been sealed away from the world for generations. David retrieved his battery-powered lantern and shone it into the darkness beyond the threshold. The beam revealed a concrete corridor extending perhaps 20 feet before ending at what appeared to be another door. The walls were lined with conduit and mounting brackets for electrical systems, and the floor was covered with a layer of fine dust that showed no signs of recent disturbance. Bruno whined urgently from above, clearly torn between his desire to follow his master and his instinct to maintain his guard position. David called up to him, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. The dog's response was immediate. He scrambled down the makeshift ladder with the agility of an animal half his age, then pressed close to David's side as they prepared to enter the buried facility together. The corridor was wider than it had appeared from the entrance, easily accommodating both man and dog walking side by side. The concrete walls bore stenciled numbers and letters that had faded with age, but remained partially legible. David recognized the style as standard military marking systems from the World War II era, used to identify different sections and systems within large installations. The air inside was remarkably dry, suggesting that the facility's original waterproofing had remained largely intact despite decades of abandonment. This was encouraging. Dry conditions would have preserved any documents, equipment, or other artifacts that might have been left behind when the installation was sealed. The second door proved to be unlocked, its handle turning easily despite the facility's age. Beyond it lay a larger chamber, perhaps 30 feet square, with a ceiling high enough to accommodate normal standing height. David's lantern beam swept across the space, revealing a scene that took his breath away. The chamber was filled with equipment and materials that had clearly been abandoned in place when the facility was sealed. Along one wall stood a bank of radio equipment, massive vacuum tube receivers and transmitters that represented the cutting edge of 1940s communication technology. Cables snaked across the floor and up the walls, connecting various pieces of equipment in a complex network that must have required considerable expertise to operate. Another wall was lined with filing cabinets, their metal surfaces dulled by age, but apparently undamaged by moisture or corrosion. A large table in the center of the room supported what appeared to be maps and documents, protected by heavy plastic sheeting that had been carefully secured around the edges. Smaller tables held additional equipment, devices that David could not immediately identify, but which had the distinctive appearance of scientific or technical instruments. Bruno moved through the chamber with careful steps, his nose working constantly as he processed the complex layers of scent that decades of abandonment had created. The dog showed particular interest in one corner of the room, where a smaller door led to what appeared to be an additional chamber or storage area. David approached the filing cabinets first, drawn by the possibility that they might contain documents explaining the facility's original purpose. The first cabinet he tried was locked, but age had weakened the mechanism sufficiently that moderate pressure with the pry bar was enough to force it open. Inside were rows of manila folders, their tabs bearing typed labels that were partially legible despite fading. The folder labels referenced various code names and project designations: Operation Paperclip, Project Venona, Manhattan Engineer District. David recognized some of these names from his reading of World War II history, but others were completely unfamiliar. He selected several folders at random, carrying them to the central table, where his lantern provided adequate light for reading. The documents inside the first folder were immediately recognizable as classified military correspondence, bearing the security markings and formatting that David knew from his own military service. The dates ranged from 1943 to 1947, covering both the war years and the immediate post-war period. The letterheads identified various government agencies and military commands, many of which David had never heard of despite his extensive study of the period. As he read through the documents, a picture began to emerge of the facility's role in the larger war effort. This had been a communication and coordination center for highly classified projects, serving as a secure location where sensitive information could be processed and transmitted without risk of interception by enemy intelligence services. One document that particularly caught David's attention was a memorandum dated September 1945, just weeks after the end of the war with Japan. It referenced the emergency relocation of personnel and materials from European theater operations, and included lists of names, most of which appeared to be German or Eastern European. The memorandum was signed by officials from multiple agencies, suggesting a coordinated effort involving both military and civilian authorities. Bruno had continued his exploration of the chamber, eventually settling near the smaller door he had identified earlier. The dog's behavior was more subdued now, lacking the excited urgency he had shown during the excavation phase. Instead, he seemed content to serve as a patient sentinel, while David worked through the accumulated documents and materials. The radio equipment, while obsolete, was in remarkable condition. David's technical background allowed him to recognize many of the components and understand their function within the larger communication system. This had been a sophisticated installation, capable of both receiving and transmitting on multiple frequency bands and maintaining contact with similar facilities around the world. A logbook found near the radio equipment provided additional insights into the facility's operations. The entries, written in multiple hands, documented daily activities from 1944 through early 1947. Most entries were routine weather reports, equipment maintenance, personnel changes, but some hinted at more significant events. One entry from December 1944 simply noted package received from Normandy via Atlantic relay. Contents forwarded to Washington per Protocol 7. Another, dated August 1945, stated all Sunrise materials secured pending final disposition. David recognized Sunrise as the code name for Operation Sunrise, a controversial intelligence operation that had involved negotiations with German forces in Italy during the final months of the war. The fact that materials related to this operation had passed through the Pennsylvania facility suggested its importance in the intelligence community of the era. The protected documents on the central table proved to be maps and technical diagrams, carefully preserved under heavy plastic sheeting that had been sealed with military precision. David carefully removed the protective covering, revealing detailed topographical maps of various regions in Europe and what appeared to be structural diagrams for underground facilities, similar to the one he was now exploring. One map showed locations throughout Germany marked with symbols and code numbers. Handwritten notes in the margins referenced personnel extraction points and material recovery sites. David realized he was looking at documentation of the massive effort to capture German scientists, engineers and technical specialists before they could be recruited by Soviet forces. The technical diagrams were equally revealing, showing detailed construction plans for secure communication facilities and storage bunkers. The level of detail was extraordinary, including specifications for concrete thickness, ventilation systems, power generation, and electromagnetic shielding. These were not hasty wartime constructions. They represented a sophisticated understanding of how to build installations that could remain operational and secure for extended periods. Bruno's patient vigil was interrupted by a sound that David initially dismissed as settling in the old structure. But the dog's immediate alertness suggested that the sound was significant. Bruno moved to the entrance corridor, his ears forward and his body tense with the focused attention that indicated potential threat or the approach of unknown persons. David quickly secured the documents he had been examining, gathering the most significant materials into a manageable bundle. His military training had taught him never to ignore warning signs, and Bruno's alert behavior was as clear a warning as any electronic sensor. Someone or something was approaching the property, and David needed to be prepared for the possibility that his excavation had attracted unwanted attention.
Moving quickly but quietly, David made his way back through the corridor to the entrance, Bruno close behind him. At the threshold, he extinguished his lantern and listened carefully. The sounds were clearer now, the distinctive rumble of vehicles moving slowly along the gravel lane that led to his property. David climbed carefully out of the crater, leaving Bruno to monitor the entrance while he positioned himself where he could observe the approach to the house. What he saw confirmed his concern. Two dark-colored SUVs were moving up the lane, their windows tinted and their occupants invisible. These were not local residents or county officials making routine visits. The vehicles parked in a formation that blocked the lane, preventing easy escape from the property. 4 men emerged, all wearing dark clothing and moving with the coordinated precision that marked them as either law enforcement or military personnel. They were armed, though their weapons remained holstered, and they deployed around the property with practiced efficiency. One man, clearly the leader, approached the house while his companions took positions that allowed them to monitor all approaches. David recognized the tactical formation from his own training. These men were professionals, operating according to established protocols for securing potentially hostile territory. David made a quick decision. Rather than attempting to hide or flee, he would meet the approaching men openly, presenting himself as a cooperative property owner who had nothing to conceal. He called Bruno to his side and walked toward the house, making no sudden movements that might be interpreted as threatening. The leader of the group was a tall man in his 50s, with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. He wore a well-tailored suit despite the rural setting, and his approach was confident but non-threatening. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who expected to be obeyed. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm Agent Harrison with the Department of Defense. I understand you've made an interesting discovery on your property." Harrison's tone was professional but not unfriendly, suggesting that David was not considered a threat or suspect in whatever investigation had brought the federal agents to rural Pennsylvania. David nodded, maintaining the respectful but not deferential attitude he had learned during his military service. "Agent Harrison, I did uncover what appears to be some kind of wartime installation after yesterday's storm. I was planning to contact the appropriate authorities once I had a better understanding of what I'd found."
Harrison smiled, the expression suggesting that he found David's statement both expected and acceptable. That's exactly the kind of responsible behavior we hope for from citizens who make discoveries of this nature. The installation you've uncovered is indeed significant from a historical perspective, and we appreciate your cooperation in ensuring that any materials or information are properly secured. The agent's words were carefully chosen, acknowledging David's discovery without revealing what the government already knew about the facility. It was clear that the Department of Defense had been monitoring the situation, possibly through surveillance systems that David had been unaware of, or through historical records that had flagged the location when David had purchased the property. Bruno remained close to David's side throughout the conversation, his behavior calm but watchful. The dog had assessed the newcomers and apparently concluded that they posed no immediate threat, though his alertness suggested he remained ready to defend his master if circumstances changed. Harrison gestured toward the crater where the entrance to the facility remained open. With your permission, we'd like to conduct our own assessment of the site and ensure that any materials of national security significance are properly handled. We understand that you've already entered the facility, and we'd appreciate your cooperation in briefing our technical team on what you observed. David recognized that this was not really a request, despite Harrison's polite phrasing. The federal government had both the legal authority and the practical power to seize the site regardless of David's preferences. His cooperation was being solicited as a courtesy, but cooperation would ultimately be mandatory whether he agreed or not. Of course, David replied, I'd be happy to share what I found and assist your team in any way possible. I should mention that I did remove some documents from the facility for examination, but I can provide those to your team immediately. Harrison nodded approvingly. We'd appreciate that, Mr. Mitchell. I should also inform you that this site and any materials recovered from it fall under the provisions of the National Defense Authorization Act. While we don't anticipate any restrictions on your use of your property, there may be some temporary limitations while we conduct our assessment. The agent's mention of federal legislation was another polite way of informing David that his discovery had triggered legal mechanisms that placed the site under government control. David's ownership of the property would be respected, but his access to the buried facility would be subject to federal oversight for the foreseeable future. Over the next several hours, David watched as a full team of specialists arrived to examine the underground installation. The initial four-man team was joined by technical experts, archaeologists, and what appeared to be intelligence analysts, all working under Harrison's overall supervision. Their equipment was sophisticated, and their procedures were thorough, suggesting that the government took the site's significance seriously. David was questioned extensively about his discovery process, his observations inside the facility, and his handling of the documents he had removed. The questions were professional and courteous, but thorough enough to ensure that no detail was overlooked. Bruno was also examined by a specialist who appeared to be a veterinary technician, presumably to ensure that the dog had not been exposed to any hazardous materials. The documents David had found were photographed and catalogued before being secured in specialized containers that suggested they contained sensitive or classified information. Harrison explained that the materials would be reviewed by appropriate authorities to determine their current security classification and historical significance. As the day progressed, David began to understand that his accidental discovery had intersected with ongoing government efforts to locate and secure Cold War-era installations and materials. The facility beneath his property was apparently one of many similar sites that had been established during the 1940s and then abandoned or forgotten as political priorities and technological capabilities changed. Harrison eventually provided David with a more complete explanation of the situation. The buried facility had been part of a network of secure communication and coordination sites established during World War II to support intelligence operations in occupied Europe. After the war, it had been used briefly for processing German scientists and technical specialists who were being relocated to the United States under Operation Paperclip. The site had been sealed and abandoned in 1947 when changing political circumstances made its location and function inappropriate for ongoing operations. The government had intended to eventually remove or destroy the facility, but bureaucratic delays and budget constraints had resulted in it simply being forgotten until David's accidental discovery had brought it back to official attention. Mitchell, Harrison said as his team prepared to depart, "I want to thank you for your cooperation and professionalism in handling this situation. Your military background clearly prepared you to understand the sensitivities involved, and your responsible approach has made our job much easier." Harrison handed David a business card and a folder containing official documentation. The folder contains information about the legal status of the site and your rights as the property owner. While we'll need to maintain some oversight during our assessment phase, we don't anticipate any permanent restrictions on your use of the property. The agent paused, looking directly at David with an expression that suggested the conversation was moving from official business to personal communication. "I should also mention that the materials you discovered may have significant historical value beyond their security implications. If our review determines that they can be declassified, we'd be interested in working with appropriate institutions to ensure they're made available to researchers and historians." As the government vehicles departed down the gravel lane, David found himself standing in his driveway with Bruno, looking at a property that had been permanently changed by the events of the past 24 hours. The crater remained, now surrounded by official markers and sealed with temporary barriers that indicated ongoing federal interest in the site. The folder Harrison had provided contained detailed information about the legal framework that now governed the discovered facility. David read through the documents carefully, noting that while his property rights were protected, he was now bound by various security regulations and reporting requirements that made him in effect a temporary custodian of a piece of American intelligence history. Bruno seemed to sense that the excitement of discovery had given way to a more complex situation that required different responses. The dog remained close to David as they toured the property, checking for any changes or disturbances that the government team might have created during their assessment activities. That evening, as David sat on his porch reflecting on the day's events, he realized that his quiet retirement had been permanently altered by the storm that had revealed secrets buried for more than 7 decades. The discovery had brought him back into contact with the world of national security and government operations that he had left behind when he retired from the army. But it had also connected him to a piece of American history that few people would ever have the opportunity to experience directly. The documents and equipment he had seen represented the efforts of previous generations to protect and preserve the freedoms that he had spent his own career defending. Bruno settled at his feet, the dog's calm presence a reminder that some things remained constant even when circumstances changed dramatically. The bond between man and dog, the importance of loyalty and trust, the value of careful observation and prudent action, these fundamentals had guided them through the discovery process and would continue to serve them as they navigated whatever developments might follow. The mystery of the buried facility was far from solved. The government's assessment would undoubtedly reveal additional information about its original purpose and the significance of the materials it contained. David's role in that process was uncertain, but he was confident that his military experience and his genuine interest in historical truth would make him a valuable contributor to whatever investigations might follow. The storm had changed everything, just as the title promised. But perhaps more importantly, it had reminded David that retirement from active service did not mean retirement from responsibility or engagement with the larger currents of history that continued to shape the world around him. 3 weeks had passed since Agent Harrison and his team had left David's property, taking with them boxes of classified documents and photographic evidence of everything they had found in the buried installation. The official barriers around the crater had been removed, and the site had been carefully sealed with new concrete and a steel plate that bore only a small Department of Defense identification number. David had received regular updates from Harrison's office, brief communications that confirmed the ongoing investigation, while revealing little about what the government analysis had discovered. The documents he had found were undergoing review by multiple agencies, and the historical significance of the site was being evaluated by specialists from the National Archives and the Smithsonian Institution. Bruno had returned to his normal routines, though David noticed that the dog still showed unusual interest in the area where the bunker entrance had been sealed. During their daily walks around the property, Bruno would pause at the site and sniff the air with the focused attention that had originally led to their discovery. Whatever sense or vibrations had initially captured the dog's attention seemed to persist despite the government's efforts to secure the installation. The quiet rhythm of David's retirement had been permanently altered by the events of that stormy July afternoon. Where once his days had been filled with simple maintenance tasks and solitary reflection, he now found himself researching World War II intelligence operations and corresponding with historians who had learned of his discovery through official channels. One such historian was Dr. Margaret Chen, a professor at Pennsylvania State University, who specialized in the domestic aspects of American intelligence operations during the war years. She had contacted David after receiving permission from the Department of Defense to interview him about his discovery and the materials he had observed before the government team arrived. Dr. Chen arrived on a crisp October morning, driving a practical sedan that seemed more appropriate for academic pursuits than the official vehicles that had dominated David's lane during the summer. She was a woman in her early 40s with an intelligent, engaged manner and the kind of focused curiosity that marked serious scholars. Bruno greeted her with the polite interest he reserved for visitors who posed no threat but warranted observation. The dog had developed an uncanny ability to assess the intentions of people who came to the property, and his calm acceptance of Dr. Chen suggested that she represented no danger to either David or the secrets that lay buried beneath the Pennsylvania soil. "Mr.
Mitchell," Dr. Chen said as they settled on the porch with coffee, "I want to thank you for agreeing to speak with me. The site you discovered represents a significant addition to our understanding of wartime intelligence operations, and your observations before the official investigation began are invaluable for historical purposes." David appreciated her straightforward approach. Academic historians, he had learned, shared many characteristics with military officers. They valued accuracy, thoroughness, and the kind of systematic thinking that produced reliable results. Dr. Chen's questions were precise and well-informed, suggesting that she had done extensive research into the broader context of his discovery. "From what I've been able to learn through official channels," Dr. Chen continued, "your installation was part of a network of secure facilities established in 1943 to support what were then called special operations in the European theater. These sites served multiple functions: communication relay points, temporary holding facilities for sensitive materials, and coordination centers for intelligence operations that required absolute secrecy." She opened a leather portfolio and withdrew several photocopied documents. "These are declassified materials from the National Archives that reference your facility. The code designation was Station Echo 7, and it was operational from October 1943 through March 1947. During that period, it processed intelligence from various sources and served as a way station for personnel and materials being transferred between Europe and other domestic installations." David studied the documents, recognizing some of the formatting and security markings he had observed in the materials found inside the bunker. The official correspondence painted a picture of a sophisticated operation that had handled some of the most sensitive intelligence of the war years. "What makes your discovery particularly significant," Dr. Chen explained, "is that Station Echo 7 appears to have been one of the primary processing centers for Operation Paperclip materials. When German scientists and engineers were brought to the United States, many of them passed through facilities like yours before being assigned to their final destinations." She showed David a roster that had been declassified in the 1980s.
This list contains the names of German specialists who were processed through various domestic facilities between 1945 and 1947. According to the archival records, more than 200 individuals passed through Station Echo 7 during that period. The implications were staggering. David's peaceful Pennsylvania farm had once been a crucial link in one of the most controversial intelligence operations of the 20th century. The underground rooms where he had found radio equipment and filing cabinets had once housed German rocket engineers, aircraft designers, and weapons specialists who would go on to play key roles in America's space program and defense industries. Dr. Chen, David said, "The documents I found mention something called sunrise materials. Do you know what that refers to?" The historian's eyes lit up with the excitement of someone whose research had just received unexpected confirmation. Operation Sunrise was an incredibly sensitive negotiation that took place in Switzerland during the final months of the war. American intelligence officers met secretly with German commanders to arrange the surrender of Nazi forces in northern Italy. The operation was controversial because it excluded Soviet participation, and it may have contributed to post-war tensions with Stalin. She leaned forward, her scholarly excitement evident. "If your installation processed sunrise materials, it means that some of the most sensitive diplomatic and intelligence documents from the end of the European war passed through your property. Those materials would have included identity documents for German officers who were being protected from Soviet capture, along with technical intelligence about German weapons programs." Bruno had been listening to their conversation with the patient attention he showed to all extended discussions on the porch. Now he rose and moved to the edge of the steps, his ears forward as he detected the approach of a vehicle. David followed the dog's gaze and saw a familiar dark SUV making its way up the gravel lane. Agent Harrison emerged from the vehicle alone this time, his manner suggesting that this visit was less official than his previous appearance. He approached the porch with the same professional bearing, but David detected a subtle change in his demeanor that suggested personal rather than purely governmental interest in the ongoing situation. "Mr. Mitchell, Dr. Chen," Harrison said with a nod to both. "I hope you don't mind the interruption, but I have some information that I thought you'd both find interesting." Dr. Chen looked between David and the federal agent with the keen attention of someone who recognized that she was about to witness a significant development in her research. David gestured for Harrison to join them on the porch, and Bruno settled back into his watchful position at David's feet. "The analysis of the materials you discovered has been completed," Harrison began, "and I'm authorized to share some of our findings with you. The Department of Defense has determined that the historical value of these materials outweighs any remaining security concerns, and we're prepared to work with academic institutions to make much of the documentation available to researchers." He produced a thick folder from his briefcase. "What you found, Mr. Mitchell, represents one of the most complete records of domestic intelligence operations from the 1943 to 1947 period that has ever been recovered. The documents include personnel files, operational reports, and correspondence that fill significant gaps in our understanding of how these operations were conducted." Harrison opened the folder and showed them several photocopied pages. "Perhaps most significantly, your installation appears to have been the final destination for a collection of documents that were removed from Berlin in the closing days of the war. These materials had been given up for lost until your discovery brought them back to light." David recognized some of the document formats from his brief examination of the materials before the government team had secured them. "What kind of documents are we talking about?" "Technical specifications for advanced German weapons programs, including rocket technology that was years ahead of anything the Allies possessed at the time. Personnel files for German scientists and engineers, including detailed assessments of their expertise and their potential value to American research programs. And diplomatic correspondence from the highest levels of the Nazi government, including communications that shed new light on German surrender negotiations." Dr. Chen was taking notes rapidly, her academic excitement barely contained. "Agent Harrison, This could revolutionize our understanding of the transition from wartime intelligence operations to the Cold War intelligence establishment. Are you saying that these documents will be made available for scholarly research? Harrison nodded. That's exactly what I'm saying, Dr. Chen. The President himself has approved the declassification of these materials, with the understanding that they represent an important piece of American history that deserves scholarly attention. We're working with the National Archives to establish a research program that will make the documents accessible while ensuring appropriate handling of any materials that retain security sensitivity. He turned to David with an expression that suggested the conversation was moving into more personal territory. Mr. Mitchell, the Department of Defense would like to offer you a unique opportunity. We'd like you to serve as a consultant to the research program, drawing on your military background and your direct experience with the discovery. The position would involve working with historians and archivists to ensure that the materials are properly understood and contextualized. David was quiet for several moments, considering the implications of what Harrison was proposing. The offer represented a return to government service, albeit in a very different capacity than his military career. It would mean engaging with the world of academic research and historical scholarship, fields that had always interested him, but which he had never had the opportunity to pursue professionally. More importantly, it would give him a sense of purpose that had been missing from his retirement. The discovery of Station Echo 7 had awakened something in David that he had thought was permanently dormant, a desire to contribute to something larger than his own immediate needs and interests. I'd be honored to accept that position, David said finally. The materials deserve proper scholarly attention, and I'd like to help ensure that their historical significance is fully understood. Dr. Chen looked between David and Harrison, with the satisfaction of someone who had just witnessed the formation of a collaboration that would benefit her own research immensely. Mr. Mitchell, this is wonderful news. Your direct experience with the discovery process will be invaluable as we work to understand the full scope of what Station Echo 7 represented. Harrison smiled, the expression transforming his usually stern features. I should mention that the position comes with security clearance and access to additional materials that are related to your discovery. We've located records from other installations in the network, and there may be opportunities to visit some of those sites as part of the research process. The conversation continued for another hour, covering the practical details of David's new consulting role and the timeline for beginning the declassification and research process. Harrison explained that the first phase would involve creating a comprehensive catalog of all materials found at Station Echo 7, followed by detailed analysis of their historical context and significance. Dr. Chen described the academic consortium that was being formed to study the materials, including historians from major universities and specialists in intelligence history, World War II studies and Cold War research. David's role would be to serve as a bridge between the academic community and the intelligence agencies that controlled access to the classified materials. As the afternoon wore on, David found himself looking forward to the challenges and opportunities that his new position would provide. The quiet isolation that had initially attracted him to rural Pennsylvania would remain, but it would be balanced by meaningful engagement with scholars and researchers who shared his interest in understanding the hidden histories of American intelligence operations. Bruno seemed to sense the change in his master's mood and demeanor. The dog's behavior had become more alert and purposeful, as if he understood that their quiet retirement was evolving into something more active and engaging. During their evening walk around the property, Bruno showed renewed interest in exploring areas that had been neglected during the months of purely routine maintenance activities. The sealed entrance to Station Echo 7 remained as a permanent reminder of the discovery that had changed everything. David paused at the site during their walk, looking at the steel plate and concrete that now concealed the underground chambers where so much history had been preserved. The knowledge that he would soon have legitimate access to similar installations filled him with anticipation for the work that lay ahead. Over the following weeks, David began the transition from retired veteran to historical consultant. His new position required security clearance updates and briefings on the handling of classified materials, processes that were familiar from his military service, but which took on new meaning in the context of historical research. The first installation he visited as part of his consulting work was located in the mountains of West Virginia, a facility that had served as a communication hub for intelligence operations in the Pacific Theater. Like Station Echo 7, it had been sealed and forgotten after the war, only to be rediscovered when a highway construction project had uncovered part of its ventilation system. The West Virginia site was larger and more complex than David's own discovery, containing multiple underground levels and evidence of more sophisticated operations. Working with a team of archaeologists and historians, David helped document the layout and contents of the facility, drawing on his experience at Station Echo 7 to identify significant materials and understand their operational context. Bruno accompanied David on these research trips, serving as both companion and working partner. The dog's acute senses proved valuable in detecting hidden chambers and concealed materials that might otherwise have been missed. Bruno's behavior at the West Virginia site led to the discovery of an additional storage room that contained technical documents related to Japanese weapons programs captured during the Pacific War. Chen became a regular collaborator in David's consulting work, bringing her academic expertise to bear on the historical questions raised by each new discovery. Together they developed methodologies for documenting and analyzing the materials found at various installations, creating a systematic approach that ensured nothing of historical significance was overlooked. The work was intellectually challenging and personally fulfilling in ways that David had not experienced since his military service. Each installation told a different piece of the story of American intelligence operations during and immediately after World War II, and David found himself becoming an expert in a field that few people had ever had the opportunity to study comprehensively. The research also connected David with a community of scholars and intelligence professionals who shared his commitment to understanding the hidden histories of the war years. These relationships provided the kind of intellectual stimulation and camaraderie that he had missed during his isolated retirement, while still allowing him to maintain his peaceful rural lifestyle. 6 months after his discovery of Station Echo 7, David received a letter that would provide the final piece of the puzzle that had begun with Bruno's excited digging in the crater left by the fallen oak tree. The letter was from a woman named Catherine Weber, who identified herself as the daughter of Dr. Heinrich Weber, a German physicist who had been brought to the United States under Operation Paperclip. Dr. Weber, according to his daughter's letter, had spent several weeks at Station Echo 7 in the spring of 1946 while awaiting assignment to a research position at a major American university. During his time at the facility, he had kept a detailed diary of his experiences and observations, written in a mixture of German and English and hidden among his personal papers for more than 70 years. Catherine Weber had discovered the diary while settling her father's estate after his death at the age of 98. Reading through his wartime experiences had led her to research the American facilities where he had been housed, ultimately leading her to news reports about David's discovery and the subsequent historical research project. Mr. Mitchell, her letter concluded, my father wrote extensively about the kindness and professionalism of the American personnel who processed him and his colleagues through Station Echo 7. He often spoke of how that experience convinced him that he had made the right choice in accepting American protection rather than attempting to return to Soviet-occupied Germany. I believe his diary would be valuable to your research, and I would be honored to contribute it to the historical record. David shared Catherine Weber's letter with Dr. Chen and Agent Harrison, both of whom recognized the extraordinary value of a first-person account from someone who had actually lived through the Station Echo 7 experience. Arrangements were made for Catherine to travel from California to Pennsylvania, bringing with her the diary and other materials that her father had preserved from his time in American custody. The meeting took place in David's living room, with Catherine Weber, Dr. Chen, Agent Harrison, and David gathered around the coffee table where Heinrich Weber's diary lay open to pages that described his arrival at Station Echo 7 in April 1946. Bruno lay nearby, his presence providing a sense of continuity between the dramatic discovery and the scholarly work that had grown from it. Catherine was a woman in her 60s, with the thoughtful manner and careful speech that marked someone who had grown up bridging two cultures and languages. She had brought not only her father's diary but also photographs, technical drawings, and correspondence that documented his transition from German scientist to American citizen. My father always said that his time at Station Echo 7 was when he truly understood that he had found refuge in America. The facility was not luxurious, but the staff treated him and his colleagues with respect and helped them understand what would be expected of them in their new country. The diary entries painted a vivid picture of daily life at the installation during the post-war period. Dr. Weber described the underground facilities, the security procedures, and the interaction between American personnel and German specialists who were adjusting to their new circumstances. His scientific training had led him to make detailed observations about the facility's construction and operations, providing insights that complemented the official documents David had discovered. One entry, dated May 15, 1946, was particularly revealing. Today we received news that more of our colleagues have arrived from the British zone. The American officers seem concerned about Soviet activities in Germany, and there is much discussion about the need to move quickly to secure personnel and materials before they fall into Russian hands. I am grateful to be here rather than facing an uncertain future in the chaos of occupied Germany. Dr. Chen read through the diary with the excitement of a scholar who had discovered a primary source that would transform understanding of her subject. Catherine, this is extraordinary. Your father documented aspects of the Operation Paperclip experience that are completely absent from official records. His perspective as someone who lived through the process provides insights that no government document could offer. Agent Harrison was equally impressed by the diary's contents, particularly the detailed descriptions of security procedures and the interaction between different intelligence agencies. Dr. Weber's observations confirm several aspects of the operation that we've only been able to infer from fragmentary official records. This diary fills important gaps in our understanding of how these facilities actually operated. The conversation continued through the afternoon, with Catherine sharing stories her father had told about his time at Station Echo 7 and his subsequent career as a physics professor at a major American university. Dr. Weber had gone on to make significant contributions to American science and technology, and had raised a family that included 3 children who had all pursued successful careers in various fields. As evening approached, Catherine made an offer that surprised everyone in the room. Mr. Mitchell, my father often spoke about wanting to return to Station Echo 7 to see how it had been preserved. He never had the opportunity, but I believe he would be pleased to know that his diary is helping to ensure that the history of the facility is properly recorded. She paused, looking around the comfortable living room where they had spent the day examining her father's memories. I would like to make a donation to support the ongoing research. My father's success in America was built on the foundation of safety and opportunity that facilities like Station Echo 7 provided. I think he would want to contribute to ensuring that this history is preserved for future generations. Catherine's donation, combined with federal funding and academic grants, established the Station Echo 7 Historical Research Foundation, with David serving as its executive director. The foundation's mission was to locate, document, and preserve the history of domestic intelligence installations from the World War II era, ensuring that this previously hidden aspect of American history would be accessible to scholars and the general public. Bruno, now recognized as the Foundation's unofficial mascot, continued to play an active role in the field research that identified and explored additional installations. His acute senses had led to discoveries at more than a dozen sites across the eastern United States, each one contributing new pieces to the puzzle of wartime intelligence operations. 2 years after that stormy July afternoon when an ancient oak tree had fallen and exposed buried secrets, David found himself standing before a congressional committee that was considering legislation to create a national program for preserving World War II intelligence sites. Bruno sat calmly beside the witness table, his presence serving as a reminder of how the most significant discoveries often came from the most unexpected sources. "Congressman Bradley," David said in response to a question about the historical significance of the installations, "these sites represent a crucial but largely forgotten aspect of American history. They show how our intelligence community developed during the war years and evolved into the institutions that helped win the Cold War. More importantly, they preserve the stories of thousands of people, both Americans and Germans, whose lives were shaped by the extraordinary circumstances of that era." The legislation passed with bipartisan support, establishing the World War II Intelligence Heritage Program and providing federal funding for the systematic identification and preservation of similar sites across the country. David's discovery had grown into a national effort to ensure that this hidden history would be preserved for future generations. Bruno's role in the original discovery was officially recognized when the program's first research vessel was christened the USRS Bruno, in honor of the Belgian Malinois whose curiosity and persistence had started it all. The dog attended the ceremony with typical dignity, accepting the attention as his due while remaining focused on his primary responsibility of staying close to David. The quiet retirement that David had sought in rural Pennsylvania had evolved into something far more meaningful and engaging than he had ever imagined possible. The storm that had seemed to threaten his peaceful solitude had instead revealed opportunities for service and contribution that drew on all of his experience and training while opening new avenues for growth and discovery. Standing on his porch in the early morning, coffee in hand and Bruno at his side, David often reflected on the chain of events that had transformed his life. The fallen oak tree had been replaced by a memorial garden that honored the memory of all those who had passed through Station Echo 7, both American personnel and German specialists who had found refuge in America during the chaotic aftermath of global war. The sealed entrance to the underground facility remained as a reminder of the discovery, but it was no longer a source of mystery. David now possessed complete documentation of Station Echo 7's history and operations, along with the satisfaction of knowing that this knowledge was being preserved for future generations of scholars and citizens. Bruno had grown older and grayer during the years since their discovery, but his enthusiasm for exploration and investigation remained undiminished. The dog continued to serve as David's partner in field research, and his acute senses had led to discoveries that would have been impossible without his participation. Their partnership had become a model for the integration of working animals into archaeological and historical research projects. The Foundation's work had expanded to include educational programs that brought students and teachers to preserved sites, allowing them to experience firsthand the hidden history of American intelligence operations. David found particular satisfaction in these educational activities, knowing that young people were learning about the complexity and importance of the intelligence work that had helped secure Allied victory in World War II. The success of the research program had also led to international recognition and collaboration. German historians and institutions had contributed materials and expertise to the project, helping to provide complete context for the Operation Paperclip experience from both American and German perspectives. These collaborations had built bridges between former enemies and contributed to mutual understanding of the difficult choices faced by individuals on all sides during the war years. Dr. Chen had been appointed as the Foundation's chief historian, and her scholarly work had produced definitive studies of domestic intelligence operations that were being used in universities across the country. Her partnership with David had demonstrated the value of combining academic expertise with practical experience in historical research. Agent Harrison had retired from government service and joined the Foundation as its Director of Security and Declassification, bringing his expertise in intelligence matters to bear on the challenge of making classified materials accessible to researchers while protecting information that might still have security implications. Catherine Weber had become a regular contributor to the Foundation's work, serving on its board of directors and helping to connect the research project with other families of Operation Paperclip participants who possessed relevant materials and memories. Her father's diary had been published as part of a collection of first-person accounts that provided unprecedented insight into the German experience of American intelligence processing. The storm that had changed everything had ultimately revealed that the most valuable discoveries often came not from seeking hidden treasures, but from being prepared to recognize the significance of what was literally beneath one's feet. David's willingness to investigate Bruno's excited discovery had opened a window into American history that had been closed for more than 70 years. The partnership between man and dog that had begun with shared solitude and mutual healing had evolved into a collaboration that contributed to historical knowledge and national understanding. Their story had become part of the larger narrative of how individual curiosity and persistence could uncover truths that enriched everyone's understanding of the past. As the sun set over the Pennsylvania countryside, casting long shadows across the memorial garden where the great oak had once stood, David felt the deep satisfaction that came from knowing that a life of service had found new purpose and meaning. The secrets buried beneath his property had been revealed, preserved, and shared, ensuring that the sacrifices and contributions of previous generations would not be forgotten. Bruno dozed contentedly at David's feet, the faithful companion whose keen senses had started a chain of discovery that would continue long after both of them had passed into history. Their partnership had shown that the most extraordinary adventures could begin with the simplest acts of curiosity and trust, and that the most valuable treasures were often those that connected the present with the hidden truths of the past. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.